Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the final event of today's joint Oxford Union International Centre for Law and Economics discussion and our whole Smashing the Silos series today. We've got a fantastic panel talking about tech policy in the geopolitics between America and China into the 2020s. And joining us is Robert Atkinson, Samantha Hoffman, and Jennifer Huddleston. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you to all of you who've joined in as well today. Thank you.
Thanks and welcome, everyone. And we will just jump right in and get started with Rob first, and then we'll move on and have some remarks from Samantha and then Jennifer. So Rob, please take it away.
Okay. Well, thanks, Sam and Jeff. It's really a pleasure to be here, and look forward to my panelists, what they have to say as well. So let me just start by saying, I find it interesting that there is a revival of interest, if you will, on industrial policy from right of center folks. You certainly see it in the US Congress and particularly the US Senate, where you have a number of Republicans now who are actively articulating the need for some sort of national industrial or technology strategy. And we should be real, we should be honest about it. What's happening here? Well, the simple word, China. Before China, our military adversaries like Russia, they might have had some military strength, but they were economically weak and technologically weak. Other competitors weren't all that strong, weren't all that big. China changes all of that. China is certainly an adversary. I don't want to call them an enemy, but they're certainly an adversary of the United States now. And their inexorable rise in technology, we see it now in the next 5-year plan of China, where they're announcing big increases in R&D. That has really changed the landscape in the US. And while you could argue before that there was a reasonably good argument for market-based approaches to economic policy, pure market-based approaches, I think you can argue that that's no longer really the case. China is requiring something else. I think it's also important to point out that the Chinese policies have had a serious effect, a negative effect on global innovation. It's not just that they're doing things in their own country. There's a recent study by David Otter and a number of colleagues, particularly at Harvard, and they studied the effect of Chinese policies on innovation, and they found, quote, they document a robust negative impact of rising Chinese competition on firm level and technology class level patent production. This is accompanied by a fall in profitability and R&D expenditures by firms exposed to Chinese competition. So something is going on, and I think that is essentially creating a need to rethink how we've thought about this in the past, and generally how we've thought about kind of market-based economic doctrines, which have a lot to be said for them, but at the same time, I think are being seen as perhaps too constraining, too much of a straitjacket. And I think these sort of tired old contentions you hear all the time, like governments can't pick winners. Is not a very useful phrase, not a very useful way to think about it, because certainly government can pick winners. The government picked the internet. It picked GPS. It picked a whole slew of technology. So to say that the government can't pick winners is obviously an oversimplification. Maybe a more accurate way would be the government sometimes does a good job and sometimes does a bad job, and there are different reasons for good and bad. So I think what that all means is we need to start taking a fresh and unbiased look at the role of the state when it comes to industry and technology. And I would argue that means we've got to move beyond these sort of just ideological assertions. Ted Broman recently, from the Heritage Foundation scholar, he wrote, quote, "The track record of industrial policy is bad." Well, when you read his article or his study where he says this, he's referring to the EU doing all the kinds of things I think everybody on this call would argue are bad. Over-regulating the economy, embracing the precautionary principle, using aggressive antitrust to go after bigger firms. Yeah, absolutely. Those are all bad things. Those are all going to deter growth and competitiveness. But to say that sort of some other things that the EU might be doing, like, for example, supporting 5G technologies or working on industrial automation is bad, again, somebody like TED offers zero evidence. A number of these programs in the U.S. have undergone thorough evaluations, like the what's called the SBIR program, or the R&D tax credit, ARPA-E in Department of Energy. Very good objective evaluations, and they show those programs actually work. I think the other thing we've got to come to grips with is that industrial policy is sort of seen, I think, in a lot of people's mind as sort of, heavy-handed, sort of kind of crony capitalism things. And I think what we have to recognize is that all it is really a set of policies oriented at industry. And let me, if I can share a screen here. And one way to think about that is if you have a national competitiveness strategy, say we want to be more competitive as an economy, whether that's the UK or the US, there's really sort of two things you can do. You have these sort of generic tools like the R&D tax credit, or saying we need better and more people educated in STEM, or more high skill immigration, or regulatory policies that don't, unnecessarily deter innovation. But then you also have a set of industry policies, and those could be everything from what we're talking about in the U.S., the CHIPS Act, which is a set of a bill to put money towards reshoring chip production and also expanding pre-competitive R&D, or, for example, what we have at the National Science Foundation to create a national robotics initiative. So in industrial policy, all it is a set of policies related to particular industries. You can do that incredibly badly, as many countries have, or you can do it well. It's sort of like saying we shouldn't have health policy. Well, what is health policy? Health policy is everything. It's a whole set of different kinds of things, some of which are good and some of which are bad. Related to that, I think, is this notion of, I hear all the time that if the US starts going down this road that sort of, beyond sort of what this, sort of box one, beyond that of sort of leaving it principally the market, that we're inexorably going all the way over to number 4 to be China. Picking particular national champions because they know the party chairman or whatever. That's bad policy. There's no question. The US government can never know enough to say that Tesla is going to be better than Ford. We have no idea. But what we do know is that electric vehicles are going to be, I should back up and say, non-gasoline vehicles are going to be the future. I don't know whether it's going to be electric. I don't know whether it's going to be hydrogen, but we do know that there's going to be something different. And so government should be thinking about how could government support non-gasoline or non-internal combustion engines. Same thing with technologies. We know, for example, that battery technology is going to be important, but we have no clue whether it's going to be just keep going with lithium or go with magnesium or all sorts of other chemistries that people come up with. So I think what all that really means is that we need to start thinking a little bit more pragmatically and carefully. Let me just sort of wrap up by saying, what does that mean, particularly for Europe, for the US and the UK? Number one, I think it means we need to be unabashedly supporting technology innovation. I'm really, deeply troubled, I guess, where I see, certainly I've been deeply troubled at where I see continental Europe for the last 5 or 10 years, where they think somehow that GMO crops are unsafe, which is nonsense. They think that everybody's privacy is going to be lost, which is nonsense, frankly. They want to regulate AI in ways that would limit the ability of European companies to do AI. To me, what distinguishes Anglo-American companies and countries is our embrace of the innovation principle. We're willing to go forward. Not to say we're libertarians and we don't think there's a role for government, but we're willing to, in the Anglo-American sphere, we're willing to sort of have faith in technological progress. And I think if we lose that and we embrace the techlash narrative and the sort of precautionary principle, I think it's all downhill after that. We might as well just give up and let China just take over. Second is, I think we need to embrace technology policies. It's clear, for example, that we have to be able to have valid 5G companies. I'm not too worried about that now because we have Ericsson and Nokia, who are obviously European. But if they were to go out of business, we're in tough shape. We cannot be dependent upon China for 5G or as we move to 6G. And lastly, again, going back to that other point, we really need to be defending innovation-oriented regulation, not precautionary. We see that with the European attacks on big companies. We see it now in the US with attacks on big companies just for being big. And I worry that the new administration in the US, in the Biden administration, is going to tilt over and perhaps too much to that side and not really show the world what US and ideally what Anglo-American leadership would look like in an innovation-based economy, which is to put the pedal to the metal for more innovation, but at the same time, helping innovators in a smart way. Not just walking away and assuming they're going to do it all, but helping them in a smart way to be able to thrive and outcompete China. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. That was great. I have 70 or 80 questions, so it'll be good to go when it comes to that. I will now turn it over to Samantha, and we will hear from you, and then, as I said, from Jennifer. Samantha, whenever you're ready, take it away. Thanks.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm going to focus my comments on the question of how does China see the tech sector and tech policy in the context of its foreign policy? Because I think oftentimes in liberal democracies, we don't correctly understand the framing behind how the PRC uses technology as a tool to expand its own power. And that's obvious in debates around Huawei, for instance, and 5G, where in liberal democracies in the UK and elsewhere, the focus has been on Huawei as an espionage risk and overlooking all the other implications that a company like that could have in the context of the way the party state sees itself attaching itself to tech companies as really a tool for its power expansion. And so the first important concept actually isn't tech and tech policy, but it's to understand the Chinese concept of state security and then how technology is attached to that concept. For the party, it describes state security not as the way that we would understand national security, but rather it puts politics and the party's power at its core. And it says that in order to protect state security, we're protecting the party's political power and the party's ideological security, as well as normal military security, environmental security, and other aspects of national security that we might be more familiar with in a liberal democratic context. And the implications of that go beyond just sort of the ideological. It actually has an impact on the way that we should see technology in its global expansion. Now, another important concept as a background, and this is really the starting point of all of my research, is the way that the party uses technology as a tool of what it calls social management. And social management is a old concept in this party state's thinking that is essentially the process of shaping, managing, and controlling. And it sees technology as a tool that it attaches to normal economic governance, normal social governance, in order to improve and optimize its processes for expanding and protecting its power. Now, within both of those concepts, neither of them are limited to just the PRC. Both of those expand outward. Because from the party's perspective, the threats that it faces, the political threats that it faces, can also come from outside of China. And so, for instance, if you look at Hong Kong, or if you look at Xinjiang, oftentimes the party's talking about how Western hostile forces are part of the threat perception that it sees potentially influencing those groups' activities. And so as technology expands globally, part of what the party wants to do is attach itself to tech companies to help achieve various objectives related to its state security. The best thing for me to do is to describe a case study. So I noticed that the party was saying we want to collect bulk data globally as a way of improving state security and our visibility of what's happening globally, to improve our ability to project propaganda, to improve our ability to do intelligence work. And I thought, well, it must be somewhere out there a company that really illustrates this intent. And I came across a company that is called Global Tone Communications Technology. And this company is controlled by the party's Central Propaganda Department. And they participate, or they engage in machine translation and translation services. So they translate in over 67 languages. And the company isn't well known globally, but they embed themselves in the supply chain of a company like Huawei and Alibaba Cloud. So for instance, their translation devices are in Huawei smart conferencing solutions. Their translation services are provided through any Ali Cloud product. And through its translation services, it collects what it says to be 2 to 3 petabytes of data per year, which is a significant amount of text and image data, and uses that. It goes back to servers controlled by the Central Propaganda Department, and explicitly says, well, we use this data to improve our voice recognition, facial recognition, and text recognition capabilities to contribute to state security. And in order to do that, they're doing things like relationship mapping. They're doing sentiment analysis, and then using that to produce tools later down the line that could be, for instance, there's a suggestion that the company engages in the automatic generation of text. And that could be used for the generation of fake comments on news, for instance. And so really what this, and I know I only have 7 minutes, so I won't go into the full case study, but I'm happy to talk about this more in Q&A. The report's called Engineering Global Consent, and it was published with ASPE in 2019. But really what it illustrates is that the party sees technology as a tool that can contribute to many things at once. On one hand, it's companies are expanding globally, which is good for China. It's on one hand, those companies are providing services that people need, but then the party's attaching itself to that and getting from that the things that it needs in order to guarantee its state security and expand its power. It's a bit of a simplification because I could go on for maybe hours explaining that. But the key point is that the party is able to attach itself to the success of its tech companies, sometimes directly because of a company like GTCom, sometimes indirectly because of things like state security legislation, which demand that companies like Huawei give up data if the party demands it, and not only give it up, but also keep that secret. One thing that I think is underestimated, and although it's entered the debate a little bit in the last year, is how much Chinese tech companies are seeking to set, and this is really a priority of the party state, seeking to set global technology standards. As part of the China Standards 2035 plan, it calls for the global export of PRC standards for emerging technologies, and for the PRC standards to be accepted at international standard setting bodies. And the problem with that is that technology in the PRC is designed for a very specific political purpose. I mentioned or rather it's used in a very political way. I described the state security legislation and the concept of social management. If you look at technologies like facial recognition or voice recognition, a lot of the standards for those domestically are set combined with the companies that are involved in their development, companies like Dahua, Hikvision, Huawei, but also in conjunction with the National Defense University System, the Ministry of Public Security. And that's where standards for things like facial recognition and voice recognition are set. And then those are built into the technologies that then win contracts domestically for smart city systems, for instance, for police geographic information systems. And it's those technologies that then get exported globally. So they're meeting the standards that are set for political security purposes internally, and then moving domestically or internationally, where we know that the party seeks to, over time, leverage the collection of bulk data in order to support its state security goals. So that's a concern. And what's more concerning is that I don't think liberal democracies are participating enough in the global standard setting system, taking into consideration that the PRC is using often the same language that we would use for concepts like privacy, but applying it in a very different way in their own political context. So a company like U2, for instance, has been granted, I guess, certification within the British Standards Organization for meeting GDPR regulations for its facial recognition technologies. But U2 is currently, its technology is deployed in Xinjiang, where the party state is currently engaged in a genocide against the Uyghur people. So that same technology that's designed for very coercive uses is somehow seen as meeting the standard of GDPR within the UK. So I think I've gone over time, so I'll stop here. But just to say, I think the biggest problem we have at the moment is that we aren't thinking through the party's lens, and we aren't understanding what it's doing through its own description of its own intent. And as a result, our responses aren't the correct responses because we aren't framing the problem in the right way most of the time.
That's great. Thank you, Samantha. Lots to talk about there as well. We now will hear from Jennifer Huddleston, and then I look forward to spirited discussion amongst us all after she's done. Thanks. Jennifer, take it away.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Samantha and Rob and ICLE and the Oxford Union for all joining us in this panel. I'm sure it will be a very good discussion and a very important discussion at this time. To begin with, I want to start with this kind of general framing for what is industrial policy. We hear this term used a lot, but it can mean several different things. The way I will be discussing industrial policy in my talk about why I don't think it is the appropriate approach to most of our emerging technologies right now is with regards to a top-down national policy, a policy that is aimed at regulating a specific industry with a goal of selecting national champions in that industry to further economic goals or to obtain national superiority within the selected industry. At its most extreme forms, this can lead to calls for nationalizing certain companies or having certain elements of technology be government controlled, but there are also various forms that can be done to through regulation, achieve the same goals. This debate has been particularly relevant, as Rob alluded to earlier, recently in the 5G space with calls for potentially a national industrial policy to ensure that there is a competitor to Huawei. But we've also seen a lot of conversations around whether there needs to be a top-down national policy in other emerging technologies too, particularly when it comes to artificial intelligence. And those tend to be more calls from Europe to really have a centralized policy on artificial intelligence. Perhaps one of the more concerning things we're seeing in tech policy in general is this growing techlash, particularly in the United States, that there is this idea that something needs to be done against these current tech giants. And perhaps as a result of that, we're seeing calls to move away from the light touch approach that has been so successful in the past. With this in mind, though, I do think there is a case for optimism and a case why the light touch approach works well, particularly when it comes to looking at these general purpose technologies that we are often seeing going forward, such as artificial intelligence or 5G. Industrial policy tends to require that top-down regulatory approach that ends up being more precautionary. It tends to be much more regulatory in terms of being more risk averse. And it locks in the idea of what the future innovation may look like, particularly when we're talking about a lot of these technologies that are emerging and we aren't entirely sure all the different directions they could go. Earlier in his talk, Rob brought up the idea of alternative fuel vehicles, and immediately he said electric vehicles. Well, electric vehicles may very well be the solution, but there are other options available. And ideally, we would want to have a market-based system that perhaps encouraged development in alternative fuel vehicles, but did not select a top-down approach, such as as electric vehicles only, or lock in a standard of what an alternative fuel vehicle could look like. Instead, we could encourage innovation more generally in the automotive space, particularly when it came to fuel technology. There's also this benefit of hindsight when it comes to calls for these grand industrial policies to combat a foe. We've seen this before in the late 80s and early 90s even, with questions about whether Japan's superiority would become such a threat to US and EU success in the telecom sector and the IT sector then. We also have seen, though, that usually innovation is able to better drive better solutions rather than only looking at the current market as it is. More broadly, we see progress happen in such a dynamic way where entirely new technologies replace other technologies more than we could have possibly dreamt of or foreseen. The other advantage is that we do have evidence of where the light touch approach has worked, particularly when we look at, say, the race to 4G. Top-down strategies did not yield the same successful, robust infrastructure or the same speed in getting to that technology that the American approach that was more light touch and hands-off had yielded. In fact, we've seen this more recently with our situation involving the increased demands on internet infrastructure around the increased work from home and school from home and everything else from home that has accompanied the current pandemic. And while Rob is right that we are not guaranteed that the government will always pick losers or that cronyism will always ensue, there hasn't really been a track record of when this approach to either create a national champion from a government directed point of view has succeeded. His paper gives some wonderful examples of where particularly European countries have attempted to do this, and we haven't really seen that success of a policy that has produced a winner that has the same impact as the light touch approach in producing many different competitors and encouraging that competition to drive innovation and entrepreneurship. There's a risk that shifting to a more top-down precautionary and industrial policy could have a negative impact, particularly on the entrepreneurial spirit and on innovation as a whole, not only by picking the wrong winners, but by that question of, do now innovators feel that the only way to succeed in their field is to have that government approval, that they have to produce an innovation that the government wants rather than the ones that the consumers want? In order to really see that progress and change, the best response is for us to allow innovators to serve their consumers, to come up with creative ideas, to solve problems that we may not have seen through our own lens, rather than a top-down approach that only selects certain industries or certain ideas as the right way to innovate in a direction. That's not to say there's never a role for government. There certainly are ways to establish a regulatory set of guardrails at times when there is a great risk. There are also ways to respond to specific problems and concerns that may arise without really having this top-down national policy. There's a way to take a light touch approach that encourages innovation through the use of soft law guidance to allow innovators to know that they are welcome in a space with minimal regulation involved. At the end of the day, I think the important thing to having a successful champion, whether it's from the EU or the United States or any other country, to challenge some of these concerns about potential other countries that might have lower ethical standards or concerns about, the national security risk, is to really encourage and support entrepreneurship and innovation in a way that provides successful alternatives for consumers and for other countries to be able to choose from. As was mentioned earlier, we are lucky in that in the race to 5G, we already have Ericsson and Nokia making huge strides, but we could also see other competitors entering that field, and we're seeing increasing deployment in that field in a way to hopefully provide many people in many countries many more options than just having to go to Huawei and the potential risk and concerns that come there. In other words, we must be careful when we're considering innovation in tech policy, not to presume that innovation in tech can only exist with our current model and our current world, but to allow us people to think broader, to think outside the box, and to completely revolutionize our everyday lives.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. I think I'd like to bring everyone together now and have some discussion around this. I was going to jump right into some questions of my own, but actually I think I should I should let you all sort of question each other. So I'm happy to start sort of back with Rob. If you have responses to any of the points that Samantha raised, I imagine you have some responses to Jennifer's points. We might start there, but I have a number of questions as well. So if that works for you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I enjoyed both presentations. I guess I would, first I thought Samantha's insights were really interesting. I'm looking forward to reading that paper you cited, so thank you. And I agree with that. The Chinese, that's the thing I think we forget about this. All of this parts about sort of letting the market work, et cetera, you know, okay, I get all that, but if we were a completely isolated economy from China, if we could force China into being just China, no exports, nothing, okay. China is part of us now. They're here and they're threatening our companies. And the way that China's doing that, I think, makes it incumbent upon us to do something. I would say with Jennifer, I think, by the way, Jennifer, just to be clear, I don't know if you missed that point. I didn't say electric. I said electric and hydrogen and others. Again, I don't even think the government knows enough to pick electric. I want to make that very, very clear. I will maintain very firmly that we do know enough that the future of internal combustion gas engines is probably limited. But I think more importantly, though, you know, Jeff, you know me, Jennifer, you know me. I have to say, not very many people I know who are more against the precautionary principle, who are more for light touch regulation than me. There aren't very many people I know who are more for entrepreneurial innovation and advancing technology than me. So I don't think that that's the right way to frame it. Now, I get it when you look at Europe. I mean, Europe is like, hey, we're doing industrial policy, and they're screwing everything else up because they hate big companies, continental Europe here, Brussels, Europe, and they want to regulate everything to death. That is not what I stand for. Now, I think your point, Jennifer, the most important one there is slippery slope argument. Okay, now that I'm willing to acknowledge that there's a slippery slope argument, but I'm not willing to acknowledge that what I'm saying is that. I am saying we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have light touch regulation, which we should have. We can have sort of a government that doesn't presume to know everything and pick everything. But at the same time, we can have a government that's more active in supporting our companies and our innovators, big and small. Last thing I'll just say, you mentioned, well, we're fortunate to have Ericsson and Nokia. I don't know that I'd call that fortunate in the sense of, I would call it because, I mean, I wrote a piece last year for the Journal of American Affairs called Who Lost Lucent? What we forget is in the year 2000, the United States had the world's largest and most innovative telecom equipment, wireless and wireline equipment companies in the world, Nortel and Lucent. Nortel Canadian, but most of their jobs in the US. By far, way more advanced than and bigger than Lucent, than Nokia and Ericsson. And in 8 years, 2008, they were both essentially dead. And they were dead in part because of China. And they were dead in part because we had no policy. We didn't care. You go back and look at when Lucent went out of business or Nortel went out of business, there was a snooze, nobody cared. And I think that was a mistake. We had to recognize that that technology was so important to the US and to the free world. We couldn't just sort of walk away from it and let it die. And so anyway, my point is we can be supportive and we can be supportive of light touch and letting, you know, the market work, but it doesn't mean we couldn't say we should support important innovations in companies and industries.
Jeff, if I can just jump in and ask a question back, because this really jumped out to me when you were showing your slides, Rob. And as you said, I've known you and I do know that you are a great defender of light touch regulation. So I hope it did not come across as accusatory.
It did not.
I'm curious, though. I do wonder at times if some of distinction and perhaps even your and I's point of view on some things is, where do you begin to consider something industrial policy in your, for example, flow chart of steps 1 through 4? It seems like you believe 3 is good, and I may disagree with you some there, but that I think we could probably both agree that there are parts of 2 that are good and necessary. So, for example, I guess the best way I can think of to ask about this is, would you consider something like the global framework for e-commerce that came out in the late 90s to be industrial policy, or would you say that that's still in step 1 and step 2?
No, what we're referring to, if people don't know, is the Magaziner framework in the Clinton administration. It was a fantastic framework. I kind of look at that as industrial policy because it wasn't about the entire world. It was about a particular area of technology that was going to be critical to the future, which was e-commerce, internet-based, commerce. So I call it industrial policy. And clearly, in my view, good industrial policy also means really looking hard at regulations and making sure they're not getting in the way of moving forward in an industry or a technology. So when I say industrial policy, that's what I was trying to get at. It's not, doesn't mean heavy-handedness. Maybe the best industrial policies is just making sure for this particular technology that we don't screw it up from a regulatory perspective. So yeah, I would call that industrial policy. But I wouldn't call something like, broadband kind of industrial policy, because that's just sort of a framework condition that helps all industries. It helps a lot of different things. I'd call that more in the 2 bucket rather than the 3 bucket, or the box, if you will.
I think there's an interesting, I think that there's going to be a lot of discussion around what is industrial policy. And I don't think it's just semantic. I mean, I think that it can be helpful in evaluating different types of rules and interventions. And I want to bring it back to China for a second, because it seems like China presents even yet another sort of form of industrial policy. It's interesting to hear, Samantha, to hear you talk about the kind of policy there being about state security and the promotion of the PRC, but at the same time, there are lots of very successful companies in China, and I'm curious whether, either intentionally or unintentionally, that is actually very much a part of the Chinese sort of approach to this as well, or if in fact those companies are sort of succeeding despite or just sort of orthogonal to the way China looks at its industrial policy.
I think, there are a lot of ways I could approach answering this question. I think that the number one thing to point out is that, and I think this gets skewed in public debate oftentimes, is that the party doesn't control everything that all commercial enterprises are doing in China, obviously. But the issue is really the way that it's able to attach itself and its priorities to them. So some of them are successful because they're able to meet the needs that the party state is prioritizing. Others, that would be a company like maybe something like Hikvision or Yi2, or I mentioned earlier, because they're engaged in, say, something like facial recognition or voice recognition, and those are technologies that the party state's prioritizing at the moment. They expand globally, and that doesn't have to do necessarily with the party facilitating that effort directly, but sometimes it does. But it's also that the party can step in at any time and say, hey, you're loyal to us because you're based in the PRC, and under PRC law, which you're obliged to follow, you must do X, Y, or Z, for instance, participate in intelligence work. That doesn't mean that the global expansion of those companies and their success is because of the party, but rather that it's able to attach itself to them.
Are they subsidizing? I mean, because you could certainly that the CCP saying you have to take on this intelligence role could actually undermine and make it more difficult for these companies to achieve the success they have. But you could also imagine that there's compensation for that, and that it's and I just want to make clear what I'm trying to get at here is that sort of compensation part of it sounds like we think of industrial policy everywhere. whether it's sort of good or bad. I mean, the number one, it seems to me like number one on everyone's list of industrial policy is throwing money at companies that you think you want to have succeed. So that's what I'm sort of asking: is there that element to it as well, or again, are these companies succeeding despite their, what may?
There's definite support for these companies, for tech champions for sure, and I think, also it's not so much that those companies necessarily, because it can be bad for them that obviously the state security and the intelligence law, but at the end of the day, they don't really have a choice. And that's part of how the system works. One issue that I wanted to touch on, because I realized that it's really critical to this conversation, and we haven't really talked about it, is also that from the PRC's perspective, universities are vehicles for China's innovation. And part of what we see the PRC doing is working to establish collaborations with universities and researchers globally and this really, this is sort of outside of my direct area of research. I'd point you to a colleague of mine, Alex Josky, who's written a lot on this topic. But essentially, China's military civil fusion strategy incorporates China's innovation goals by contextualizing them within advances in both China's defense sector and its private sector. And so the ways in which PRC universities or entities collaborate with universities in liberal democracies are of concern. And it's getting more attention in the UK. I think there was a report in the Times earlier this week about those kinds of collaborations. But that's an important part of the debate that we should also be thinking about.
In the US as well, we've been talking about these Confucius classrooms recently, a little bit more so. But actually that leads to a really good question, which is so what do? You have the Chinese government subsidizing something that you might say in the U.S. Hey, part of our industrial policy should definitely be encouraging certain forms of education. I would suggest that maybe teaching people Chinese might very well be a part of that. And here you have the Chinese government subsidizing that in the U.S. Obviously for its own purposes that may be adversarial, as Rob put it, to ours. But it's not clear to me that we in the U.S. and other countries shouldn't just take advantage of that while we can. It may be intended for some nefarious purpose, but why shouldn't we take advantage of it while we can? I mean, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how problematic these things are, Samantha, but I also sort of want to pose that question to Rob and Jennifer, because I think it sort of goes to the heart of the debate they're having as well.
It's a very difficult question to answer. And to be clear, I'm not so much talking about Confucius institutes, which I think are a bit of a separate issue, but really collaboration on emerging technologies, whether it's directly related to, obviously related to the PRC's military versus the PLA, or technologies that are a little bit more ambiguous. The problem under the PRC's military civil fusion strategy is that essentially any technology can be dual use. I talked about how language translation software is facilitating propaganda and military intelligence work, because that kind of data collection helps with relationship mapping or sentiment analysis. And all of those have direct security applications. In terms of what to do about it, for one, funding universities and funding research, in the UK especially, it's the system it's the changes in the funding model for higher education that have contributed to the rising problems with collaboration with PRC entities. Where do you draw lines? It's hard to say. I think with military technologies, that should be quite clear. With things like machine translation, not all collaboration is bad, but I don't think we should be framing it in good and bad or black and white terms. I think it's, how do we carefully address this in the long term, rather than taking the current whack-a-mole approach to dealing with any security risks that arise from Chinese tech policy. in terms of attracting PRC students to our universities, and I think the goal should be to attract them and to keep them. And so there are a lot of issues here, and I'm definitely not the best person to speak to the university issues. I think I have a couple of colleagues who are better placed to speak more intelligently about that. But I think that at the moment, because we aren't even, and I said at the end of my talk, because we aren't even adequately defining the problem, our solutions are too narrow. And I think that we need to be thinking more long-term. We did a paper at ASPE late last year on China's digital currency electronic payment system, development of its central bank digital currency. And it's a technology that we have a chance to get ahead on, because it'll be a while before the PRC succeeds in rolling that out. Certainly globally, that could be a number of years off. And DCEP solves problems for the party state. It's also a tool for enhancing control through its definition of things like money laundering or terrorist financing. So to get ahead of a technology like that and think about what our response is, that's what needs to happen, rather than responding in the Huawei 5G way, or as we did to TikTok and the risk of propaganda on that platform. So oftentimes our responses are late and they aren't holistic enough.
Rob, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, especially the idea of a kind of defensive versus offensive industrial policy.
Yeah, and I think, Jeff, your point of the Confucius Institutes are emblematic of that. To me, I would ban all of them completely, because they're not, what they really are designed to be is they're designed to be fifth columns in our system to really repress any sort of criticism of Chinese policies here. That's what they're doing. And I think that gets to the key point here. And you see it in standards, you see it in so much. We're competing against a country that looks market oriented, because they have SOEs, of course, state-owned enterprises, but a lot of their economy is private, if you will. But we've never ever seen an economy where we're talking, people talk about civil military fusion. What we're talking here is business government fusion. And the fact now that the party has mandatory political operatives on every business board, unless you're super small. I mean, we're talking about private companies who take their direction from the state, from the CCP, and get an enormous set of benefits, not just subsidies. Subsidies are actually probably not the major benefit. The major benefit they get is the second largest market essentially protected for them as an aircraft carrier. That's the main reason Huawei has been able to take off. They were able to have a completely protected market. They now have about 92% of all the 5G equipment. The only reason Ericsson is given the 8% is just totally symbolic and political. They can say they're getting that. That to me means there's only three choices that we've had. One is we could fight them, try to get them to stop doing these things, to become more like WTO, normal WTO members. Nobody's perfect. Everybody has a little bit of industrial policy here and there, sure. But the extremeness of China. So we could try to do that. I think we should keep doing that. We should keep fighting it, but I don't hold out any real serious hope for the WTO is not designed to really deal with that. Second, we could isolate them like a cancer. We could just say, do what you crazy stuff you want to do there and harmful stuff, but the rest of the world's not going to engage with you. Well, A, that would have a lot of problems because we already are engaged economically with China. And B, it's not going to happen either because Korea is not going to do it. And Europe and Germany definitely won't do it. So that really leaves the third option, which is how do we compete better with them so that we don't get so negatively affected by what they're doing in these future technologies. And that's where I really do argue we're going to have to figure out a way to have more support to some of these key technologies going forward, like 6G, like quantum, like AI. It doesn't have to be heavy-handed, but I just don't see any way to really compete effectively with the amount of money, the amount of protection. And you look at their subsidies and export controls with Belt and Road, it's beyond belief. So we're going to have to, in my view, the only real third option there is, let's try to be more competitive. And certainly some of that is going to be not doing really stupid things on regulation or not going down the path of antitrust that, frankly, the Democrats are going down right now in the U.S. That's going to be disastrous. Right. Anyway, that'd be my view on it.
So, Jennifer, what do you think about let's take the Huawei kind of response in particular. I mean, would you say we should look? Let's accept the high-tech subsidized products from Huawei. There's no real problem with that. I think, Rob, it seemed like you were saying, well, look, that horse left the barn. There's not much we're going to be able to do about that, but we need to be thinking about the next iteration and making sure that that's not where we are. But Jennifer may see that as a feature, not a bug.
So I wouldn't see Huawei as a feature, and I think it also shows to how sometimes tech policy questions get much more complicated. So for example, whether to remove Huawei from government systems is a national security question as much as it is a tech policy question. I would also caution against policies that, for example, argue for creating a backdoor in American technologies, because those could very easily create the same risk and could make other people more concerned about the usage of an American competitor, and therefore leave us in a situation where there is no good option available for people who want to have a trusted product and who are concerned about whatever security risk they may see personally or on a national level. I do kind of want to pick up on what Rob said at the end there about the importance of, looking at this light touch approach as a benefit and as a way of showing how it can be done as well, of providing an alternative that does create these great technology champions through a way that did not require heavy-handed regulation, that was not a top-down strategy, that did still see large and successful companies emerge from innovative ideas and entrepreneurial spirit. And I think it's very important, he brought up the antitrust debate and the kind of current techlash we're seeing, not only in the United States, but certainly in the EU as well, that when we're criticizing large tech companies on competition grounds, that we make sure that's based in a principled approach, that we're really looking at issues related to consumer welfare and not just a presumption that big is automatically bad and small is automatically good. Rob literally wrote the book on that to some degree, but really looking at, encouraging innovation that benefits consumers and benefits all of us as a whole by allowing new connections and new ideas to spread in a positive way.
So, I was going to say in response to that, we can all agree getting the government out of the way of exacerbating, preventing the government from exacerbating the problem seems like, sure, that's a no-brainer. We should do that. Except then I realized, well, it's not that simple, precisely because of the national security sort of implications, because of some of the stuff that Samantha was talking about. They're going to, I suppose, and in some ways, this is almost like a clarifying question for Rob. I think, Rob, you would agree that we have to act, or we being countries other than China, I guess, have to act sort of with a defensive kind of industrial policy, which becomes, we call it industrial policy, but it's really national defense policy in some sense. How do you sort of draw the line between those? Some of that may very well impede our companies in important ways. I understand the idea that we'd love it if the way it worked was just to benefit our companies in competition with those, but I'm not sure it could always work that way. I don't know, do you agree with that, or is that a
No, I do agree with that. And I'll be snide and say, look, the problem is that I'm not running things, because
I'd vote for you.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Even though I'm Canadian, I don't know that I could never be president. But no, I'm tongue in cheek. But no, the reason I say that is I thought that the Trump administration, raising the alarms about China was absolutely right. I thought that their policy, for example, around limiting semiconductor exports to China, particularly to Huawei, was stupid. I mean, it was stupid. You're not going to stop Huawei. They were just going to get their chips from somewhere else. All you're doing was hurting American chip companies. So in a way, that's really hurting my argument here, because my argument is that government could figure this stuff out. And clearly on a lot of things, they don't figure it out. They do the wrong thing.
But
you
assume that's I mean, I think.
Yeah, I don't. Here's why I don't. Here's
government is all assume the government's always going to get it wrong, and just be surprised when they occasionally get it right. That may require a different approach than if you think.
Well, yeah, I don't assume that, and here's why. Although I have to say, in the last 10 years, I'm beginning more to assume it. But here's why I don't assume it. I look at an agency like DARPA, which is designed to have certain kind of guardrails. It brings in scientists and engineers. It keeps them 5 years, and out they go. And so it has a real mission. They can evaluate it. I look at that like, pretty good. Did a pretty good job. So I worry more about sort of the broad kind of White House kinds of things. And I don't mean it just this administration, the Biden administration or Trump. That's where you get into politics, and not just politics, but sort of strange thinking, group think and all that. But specific programs that we have set up, I will vouch for. I think NIST, for example, as an agency, National Institute of Standards and Technology, is a good agency. I actually used to work there as my first job. But I guess to your point, Jeff, though, one of the reasons why we've all brought up, and Jennifer and Samantha, both about national security, and that's sort of what's different now, is a lot of this melds into that. And I don't see how we can have strong national security without a good chip industry, for example, without 6G, without lasers. There's certain kinds of technology. We have to be able, either we have to produce them, or our Aussie colleagues have to produce them, or our Brit colleagues, UK, somebody has to produce them in the family. And if we're not able to do that, that's a serious problem, which to me makes an argument for some kind of strategic approach to these technologies.
So we have only a couple of minutes left, so I want to just sort of give all three of you a chance to have a couple of concluding comments, respond to whatever you'd like, maybe no more than, sadly, about 2 minutes each. Our host may cut us off in mid-sentence if we go much beyond that. But let's start with Jennifer, and then Rob, and we'll finish with Samantha.
I think what I'd most like to leave everyone with is just a case for optimism, a case to believe that a light touch approach can work, a case to believe that innovation can flourish and solve many problems, as well as the idea that it's oftentimes become very popular now to engage in the techlash, to be anti-technology in some ways. But when we take a step back and look at how technology has improved our lives dramatically, this event alone couldn't have happened probably a decade ago with the technology we would have had. We have to really look at ways that we can embrace innovation and entrepreneurship, but also recognize that we don't always know what those technologies are going to be, and that we need a system that both recognizes those cases where there is a need for development, but also allows more flexibility for progress. And I would suggest that that is a more light touch approach than a top-down approach.
Great, thanks. Rob?
Yeah, I would say what we need is a light touch approach, no tech lash. It should be actually the opposite. It should be tech forward, or whatever you want to call them. And tech is going to be what's going to make our world and our kids' worlds a much, much better place. And by tech, I don't just mean big internet company. I mean technology generally. So I fully support a light touch regulatory approach and a medium touch industrial policy approach. I think the two aren't in conflict. I think we can chew gum and walk at the same time. What I would call on or urge my free market friends and colleagues, who I have many, is to say, I hope you could be the ones that hold Congress and the administration and others accountable when you see things that are going off the rails. Let's call them out. Let's say this is bad, this is crony, this is dumb. And there are lots of cases like that, but I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Great. And Samantha?
Listening to Jennifer and Rob's comments, it made me think that one thing that we don't have enough of at the moment is conversation between governments and the private sector and civil society on the increasing complexity and fast moving challenges that are posed by emerging technologies. So we need to develop more forums for those three parts to interact and to come up with common understandings of the opportunities and threats that are presented by new technologies, and how to deal with them, what the most effective policies would be, because I think oftentimes we're talking at each other rather than with each other, and you aren't going to deal with the challenges presented by the PRC in particular without doing that. And a bit of shameless self-promotion at ASPE, we are organizing a first annual Sydney Dialogue later this year that will do just that. But I think it needs to go beyond that as well, and that just needs to be regularized, because right now that talking at each other isn't very helpful, and it's putting us behind, I think.
I think that's a great finish here. I just want to say that a lot of what's come out of today could certainly be pointed toward more of a collaborative relationship instead of the kind of combative relationship we have now between regulator and regulated, and we can add to the list the potential threat of rogue nations as another reason for that. I want to thank you guys so much for participating here, and thank everyone for watching. We had a great day, and hope to see everyone again soon. Thanks very much, guys.